A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Alright, we've got a good one today. This is episode 2020 of My Weird Prompts. And honestly, the topic Daniel sent over is something that's been hitting my feed every single day lately. It feels like you can't go 5 minutes without seeing a headline about how Gen Alpha is destroying retail, or how Gen Z is reinventing the office. But here is the thing, who actually decided these groups exist? So, Daniel sent us this one. He wants to talk about the names we ascribe to generations, from baby boomers through to the present. He is asking when we actually started giving these nicknames to birth cohorts, and more importantly, how useful or harmful the resulting stereotypes actually are. By the way, today's episode is powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash. Herman Puppleberry, I know you have been digging into the demographic data on this one. Where does the alpha thing even come from? Because it feels like it just appeared out of thin air a couple of years ago.
It effectively did, Corn. That is actually one of the most fascinating parts of the modern generational landscape. The term Gen Alpha wasn't coined by the United States Census Bureau or a major sociological institution. It was actually coined in 2012 by a private marketing and suburban research firm in Australia called the McCrindle Research Group. They basically looked at the timeline and realized that if Gen Z ended around 2010, they needed a name for the next group. They polled people, and Alpha won out because it signified a new start. But think about the timing, 2012. The oldest members of that generation were 2 years old. We branded an entire generation before they could even form a complete sentence.
That is wild. So we are essentially pre-ordering human identities now? We have decided what their vibe is going to be before they've even hit middle school. It feels less like social science and more like a massive SEO play. I mean, if you're a marketing firm, having a trademark name for a group of toddlers is basically a license to print money for the next 20 years, right?
It's a land grab for demographic authority. If McCrindle defines the dates, McCrindle becomes the expert that Fortune 500 companies have to hire to unlock that generation's spending power. But to understand how we got to this hyper-specific branding of children, we have to look at the history, because for most of human history, generation just meant the gap between a parent and a child, about 20 to 30 years. It was a biological reality, not a cultural badge. The idea of a named, culturally distinct cohort is a very modern invention. If you go back to the early 20th century, the first real named group we talk about is the Lost Generation.
Right, the WWI era. But that wasn't a marketing term, was it? That feels more literary.
It was literary. Gertrude Stein reportedly heard a garage owner in France use the phrase une génération perdue to describe his young mechanics who were clumsy at their jobs because their lives had been disrupted by the war. She told Ernest Hemingway, "All of you young people who served in the war, you are a lost generation." Hemingway then used it as the epigraph for the sun also rises asque in 1926. It was a description of a shared trauma, not a birth year bracket.
So it was a vibe check. It was Hemingway saying, we're all messed up because of the trenches. It wasn't about being born in 1894. But how did that evolve into the rigid brackets we have now? Because 1894 to 1900 feels like a very different, lost generation experience than someone born in 1885, who was already 30 when the war started.
That's a great question, and it highlights the flaw in the whole system. The lost generation wasn't a spreadsheet, it was a feeling of disillusionment. But as sociology grew as a field, researchers wanted more precision. The greatest generation is another perfect example. That name didn't exist when those people were storming the beaches at Normandy. It was coined by journalist Tom Brokaw in 1998. He wrote a book with that title, and it stuck because it provided a heroic narrative for a group that was entering their twilight years. It was retrospective branding.
That's a huge point. We look back and give them a shiny label to wrap up their legacy. It's almost like a participation trophy for surviving the 20th century. But the baby boomers, they were the first ones to get a name while they were still in the cradle, right?
They were. The baby boom was a recognized statistical phenomenon almost immediately. Birth rates in the U.S. spiked in 1946 and stayed high until the mid-60s. But even then, the term baby boomer as a fixed cultural label took time to solidify. It was first used in print around 1941 as a prediction of what would happen after the war, but it wasn't until 1964, the year the boom actually ended, that Landon Jones at the Washington Post really cemented it. By then, the oldest boomers were 18. They were already a massive consumer bloc. And that is where the shift happens. That is when generation stops being about poetry or history and starts being about selling soda and cars.
It's the sheer scale of the boomer cohort that changed the game. If you have 76 million people born in a 20-year span, you don't just see them as people. You see them as a demographic tidal wave. But what about the people caught in the middle, like the silent generation? They always seem to get skipped over in these conversations.
The silent generation, born roughly 1928 to 1945, is actually a perfect case study in how these labels can be reductive. They were called silent because they grew up during the Depression and WW and were seen as conformist or cautious. But look at who is in that group: Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Gloria Steinem, Bob Dylan. They were the architects of the civil rights movement and the counterculture of the 60s. They were anything but silent. But because they didn't have a catchy boom attached to them, they were branded as the boring gap between the greatest and the boomers.
That's a classic example of the label obscuring the reality. We call them silent, so we stop listening to what they actually did. But then we get to Gen X, and the naming process gets a little weirder. It feels like we ran out of ideas and just started using letters.
Gen X is actually my favorite example of how a placeholder becomes a permanent identity. Before they were Gen X, they were called the Baby Busters because birth rates had dropped, or they were called the 13th generation by Strauss and Howe. But in 1991, Douglas Coupland published his novel Generation X, Tales for an Accelerated Culture. He took the X from a 1964 study of British youth that used it to describe kids who didn't want to be like their parents. Coupland's book captured this feeling of being nameless, cynical, and stuck in McJobs. The media loved it. It was a perfect brand for a group that supposedly hated brands.
It's the ultimate irony. The generation defined by its rejection of labels got stuck with a label that literally means variable X. It's like a filing cabinet era that became a culture. But did they actually embrace it at the time? Or was it just something Time magazine forced on them?
It was definitely forced. If you look at interviews from the early 90s, most people in that age bracket hated the term. They felt it made them sound like a bunch of slackers who couldn't be bothered to name themselves. But after a while, the marketing machine is so loud that you just give in. You start seeing Gen X in movie trailers and clothing ads, and eventually it's just the name of the folder you live in. But then we hit the millennials, and things get loud.
Millennials are where the science of generational naming meets the art of the 24-hour news cycle. The term was coined by William Strauss and Neil Howe in 1987. They were historians and sociologists who developed this generational theory, which suggests that history moves in 80-year cycles. They predicted that the kids born starting in 1981 would be a hero generation, civic-minded, optimistic, and tech-savvy. They chose millennial because the oldest of them would graduate high school in the year 2000.
It's worth noting that before millennials stuck, people were trying to call them Gen Y. It was the logical progression from Gen X, but it was so uninspired. Millennial had that sense of destiny to it.
It sounds very optimistic when you put it that way. But if you were on the internet in 2010, millennial was basically a slur for someone who likes avocado toast and can't afford a house. How did we go from hero generation to the most mocked demographic in history?
That's the mechanism of stereotyping Daniel mentioned in his prompt. When a label becomes a shorthand for a massive group of people, it loses all nuance. Between 2010 and 2020, millennial became a catch-all for young person I don't understand. People were calling 20-year-olds in 2019 millennials, even though the youngest actual millennials were already 23 and the oldest were nearly 40. It became an othering tool. Instead of looking at structural economic issues like the 2008 crash or the housing shortage, it was easier for the media to say, oh, they're just entitled and like brunch too much.
It's a classic deflection. Don't look at the interest rates, look at the sourdough. But I want to push back a bit on the hero versus nomad archetypes that Strauss and Howe talk about. Isn't that a bit, I don't know, astrological? It feels like we're trying to turn human history into a recurring sitcom, where the characters just change clothes every 20 years.
You're not alone in that critique. Many historians call Strauss-Howe theory pseudoscience because it's deterministic. It assumes that if you are born in a certain window, you must have certain personality traits. It's like saying, oh, you were born in '84, you must be a hero archetype. It ignores individual agency. But sociologically, there is a better framework. Karl Mannheim wrote a paper in 1928 called The Problem of Generations. He argued that a generation isn't just a birth window, it's a generational consciousness. You have to experience a major historical rupture during your formative years, usually ages 17 to 25, to truly form a cohort identity.
So, for boomers, it was the moon landing and Vietnam. For millennials, it was 9/11 and the 2008 crash. What is it for Gen Z? Is it just the internet? Because the internet feels more like a slow burn than a rupture.
The internet is the environment, but the rupture, for the older half of Gen Z, was likely the pandemic. Think about being 19 and having the world shut down, your education moved to Zoom, and your social life digitized overnight. That creates a shared trauma and a shared set of coping mechanisms that a 40-year-old millennial just isn't going to experience in the same way. The millennial already had a career and a pre-digital social foundation. The Gen Z kid had their formative becoming an adult moment mediated entirely by algorithms.
That brings us to the Gen Z acceleration. It feels like the gap between generations is shrinking. Boomers were an 18-year span. Gen X was 15. Millennials were 15. Now people are saying Gen Alpha is only 12 years? Why are we speeding up? Does time actually move faster for people who grew up with high-speed fiber?
It's the cultural half-life. Because of social media and the rapid iteration of technology, shared experiences happen much faster and fade much faster. In the 1950s, a trend might last 5 years because it took that long to move from New York to the Midwest via magazines and radio. Now, a trend lasts 5 weeks on TikTok. If you were born in 2005, your digital childhood looks completely different from someone born in 2015. The 2005 kid remembers a world before the iPad. The iPad didn't come out until 2010. The 2015 kid was likely handed an iPad in their stroller. That technological gap is so visceral that we feel the need to draw a line in the sand sooner.
But isn't that just digital generation stuff? I mean, a wealthy kid in New York and a kid in rural poverty might both have iPads, but their lives aren't the same. This is where I think the harm part of Daniel's prompt comes in. These labels pretend that class and geography don't exist. We treat Gen Z as this monolithic block of social justice-oriented tech wizards, but that only describes a very specific slice of that population.
That is the biggest flaw in generational analysis. It's ageism masquerading as sociology. A wealthy millennial in London has far more in common with a wealthy Gen Xer in London than they do with a millennial working 3 jobs in a rural village. When we talk about millennial values, we are usually talking about the values of middle-class, college-educated Westerners. We erase the experience of millions of people who don't fit that narrow marketing profile. If you're a 25-year-old in a developing nation, your generational experience is defined by local politics and infrastructure, not by whether you remember the launch of the original iPhone.
It's a form of corporate profiling. If I'm the brand, I don't want to hear about the complexities of rural poverty. I want to know how to sell Gen Z a specific type of sneaker. So I buy into this monolithic idea of what a 20-year-old wants. But what happens when those kids grow up and realize they've been put in a box? Does it create a self-fulfilling prophecy where they start acting like the stereotype because that's the only identity available to them?
There is some evidence for that. It's called identity signaling. If the media tells you that Gen Z is the anxious generation, and you feel a little bit of anxiety, which, let's be honest, everyone does, you might lean into that as part of your cohort identity. We're seeing it now with the OK Boomer phenomenon. That wasn't just a meme, it was a release valve for generational tension. It was Gen Z and millennials basically saying, you categorized us as lazy and entitled for 2 decades while you held on to all the political and economic power. Now we're going to categorize you as out of touch. It's a weaponized label. When we use these shorthand terms, we stop talking to people as individuals and start talking to them as avatars of their birth year.
It's the architecture of the other situation. Like we talked about in episode 750. We love drawing lines because it makes the world easier to process. Them versus us. The olds versus the kids. But it's a lazy way to think. So, if these labels are so flawed, why does Pew Research still use them? Why does everyone keep using them? Is there any actual utility left in saying, I'm a millennial?
Because they are useful as a macro-level heuristic. If you are trying to understand how the U.S. electorate is changing, looking at the silent generation versus Gen Z tells you something about the broad shift in social attitudes toward things like marriage, religion, or climate change. The problem isn't the data, it's the application. Pew is very careful. They define millennials as 81 to 96, a strict 15-year window. They use it as a bucket to hold data. Marketing firms like McCrindle use it as a psychographic profile to predict behavior. That is where it gets dangerous.
It's the difference between saying most people in this bucket don't own homes, and people in this bucket don't own homes because they are lazy. One is a statistical observation, the other is a moral judgment. But let's talk about the workplace. Daniel mentioned workplace friction. How does this play out when you have 4 generations in one office?
It's a nightmare of miscommunication. There is research from McKinsey and the American Psychological Association showing that generational stereotypes in the office lead to reverse ageism. You have managers who won't promote a millennial because they think they'll quit in 6 months, the job-hopping stereotype, or younger employees who don't listen to a boomer colleague because they assume they can't use the software. Both assumptions are often totally wrong.
I've seen that play out. I know boomers who are more tech literate than most 20-year-olds because they actually understand how the hardware works, whereas the digital natives only know how to use the apps. The digital native thing is a huge myth. Being born with a smartphone in your hand doesn't mean you know how a file system works. It just means you're a power user of a specific interface.
That is a great distinction. In fact, a lot of teachers are reporting that Gen Alpha and younger Gen Z students are actually less tech literate in a professional sense because they grew up in walled garden ecosystems like iOS. They don't know what a folder is because everything is just in the app. So the stereotype of the tech-savvy youth is actually crumbling as we speak. If a manager assumes a 22-year-old can fix the office server just because they have a TikTok account, they're going to be very disappointed.
So we're reaching a point where the names are becoming obsolete because the reality is changing too fast, but we're still stuck with them. I want to talk about the cusp identities because I feel like that is where the whole system falls apart. The Zennials, born between 77 and 83, they say they don't feel like Gen X and they don't feel like millennials.
The Zennial or Zillennial thing is the ultimate proof that generational boundaries are arbitrary. If you are born in 1980, you are technically Gen X. If you are born in 1981, you are a millennial. Does your entire worldview change because you were born 12 months later? Of course not. The cusp groups are just people who realize the bucket they've been put in doesn't fit. They remember a pre-digital childhood playing outside until the streetlights came on, but an all-digital adulthood. They are the bridge.
It's like being a dual citizen. You speak both languages, but neither country really claims you. But wait, if we're moving toward interest-based cohorts or algorithmic segmentation, does the birth year even matter anymore? If a 60-year-old and a 16-year-old are both obsessed with the same niche subculture on YouTube, aren't they in the same generation, in terms of their cultural consciousness?
That is the second-order effect. I think we're heading toward. In a hyper-connected world, shared experience is no longer tied to your physical neighborhood or your birth year. It's tied to your For You page. We might see the end of generations and the beginning of viports. You aren't a millennial, you're a member of the True Crime Podcast cohort or the serverless cloud computing cohort. Your proximity to information matters more than your proximity to a specific historical event.
Vibe hordes. I hate that, Herman. Please don't let that become a thing. It sounds like something a startup in Palo Alto would bitch. But I get the point. The algorithm is the new historical rupture. Instead of a war, we have an algorithm that decides which reality we're going to live in. So, if you're a listener trying to navigate all this, how do you actually use this information? How do you stop being a victim of generational stereotyping?
The first takeaway is to check the source. When you see a headline that says, Gen Alpha is doing X, look at who wrote it. Is it a peer-reviewed sociological study from a university? Or is it a white paper from a marketing agency trying to get companies to hire them as consultants? 9 times out of 10, it's the latter. Marketing agencies have a financial incentive to make generations sound as different and mysterious as possible so they can sell the solution to understanding them. They want to create a problem that only their data can solve.
Buy our $5,000 report to learn why your Gen Z employees want more than just a paycheck. Spoiler, everyone wants more than just a paycheck. It's not a generational secret. It's basic human psychology.
And the second takeaway is to apply cohort analysis to your own life and work. Instead of saying, my Gen X boss is stubborn, ask, what are the structural factors that shape my boss's career? Maybe they started working during a recession where loyalty was the only way to survive. That isn't a Gen X trait. It's a rational response to their environment. When you replace personality traits with environmental factors, the stereotypes start to dissolve and you actually start seeing the person in front of you.
It's about empathy through context. Understanding that people aren't weird or entitled, they are just products of a different set of pressures. I think that is a much more useful way to look at it. But I'm still stuck on the alpha thing. If we started naming them in 2012, what happens in 2035 when we run out of Greek letters? Are we going to have Gen Beta and Gen Gamma?
McCrindle has already said the next one will be Gen Beta. It's a bit of a branding trap. Once you start a sequence, you're stuck with it. But there is a real risk here. By naming these kids Alpha, we are essentially treating them as a science experiment. We are tracking their spending power before they have an allowance. We are analyzing their brand loyalty before they can read. It's a hypercommodification of childhood. We've moved from the lost generation being a literary reflection to Gen Alpha being a target demographic for digital toy unboxing videos.
It's a bit dystopian, honestly. We're basically tagging them like migratory birds. Ah yes, the Alpha 19267 is showing a high affinity for decentralized virtual reality platforms. Target them with the interactive serial ads. It feels like we're losing the human, part of the human experience. If we tell a kid they are an alpha from the day they are born, how does that change their sense of agency?
It can be incredibly limiting. If you're told your whole life that your generation is the one that will save the planet, or the one that is obsessed with technology, you feel this weird pressure to perform that identity. And that is why I think the OK Boomer moment was so important. It was a reminder that these labels can be turned back on the people who created them. If you try to box people in, they will eventually use the box as a weapon.
It's funny because even the OK Boomer thing has already been commodified. You can buy the t-shirt at Target. The machine always wins in the end. But I think the takeaway here is that while these labels are handy for a quick conversation, they are terrible for actually understanding a human being.
Precisely. Use them for the data but ignore them for the person. A birth year is a statistic. A person is a story.
Well, on that cheery note of generational warfare and the slow death of individual identity, I think we should probably wrap this up before I start feeling too much like a sloth on a deadline. This has been a deep dive into how we've basically allowed Madison Avenue to write our history books.
It's a fascinating process, Corm. Just remember, the next time someone tells you what your generation thinks, check to see if they're trying to sell you something, or if they're just trying to make you feel bad about your breakfast choices.
Or if they're just trying to get clicks on a Tuesday morning. This has been My Weird Prompts. Thanks to Daniel for the prompt. Hope Ezra is doing well and that you're getting at least a little bit of sleep. We know those alpha toddlers can be a handful.
Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes and making sure we don't sound too much like we're stuck in the 1990s.
And a big thanks to Modell for providing the GPU credits that power the generation of this show. We couldn't do it without you.
If you enjoyed this episode, search for My Weird Prompts on Telegram to get notified the second a new episode drops. We love having you all along for the ride, regardless of what year you were born.
We'll be back soon with another prompt. Until then, stay curious, and maybe stop blaming the boomers for everything. Just most things.
Goodbye, everyone.
Later. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash, text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the flows from sloth